Hello listeners and welcome to the third edition of the NK News podcast. I'm your host, Jacko Zwetsloot, and today our special guest is Dr. Georgy D. Toloraya, currently the Professor of Oriental Studies at Moscow University of International Relations and also currently Director of the Center of Asian Strategy at the Russian Academy of Sciences. He is a former visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution and a retired diplomat, finishing in 2006 as Russian Consul General in Sydney, Australia. Welcome, Dr. Toloraya, and thank you for your time.
Yes, thank you. Good morning.
Okay, let's start by talking about the period 1978 to 1980 when you worked as a staff member at the USSR Trade Representation in Pyongyang, North Korea. How was your time there?
Well, that was my actually first visit abroad, because in Soviet Union time we didn't have much possibility to go abroad. This proved to be a fascinating country. I felt as if I got back, maybe 30 years and saw the country which my parents, my grandparents spoke about the Soviet Union. It was so, regulated, and it was so, communism-oriented, which was not the case in Soviet Union any longer. Since I've studied the language for 5 years, by that time, I thought that it would be easy for me to get around, but I found out that neither Koreans understand what I say, nor do I understand what they say, at least in full. So it took me, several months to get accustomed, and then I have to interpret almost every day and got used to it.
Was that different pronunciations? Is that the reason, or they have a different...
Problem is that way back then we didn't have enough of the, teachers whose mother's tongue was Korean.
Yes.
We had one or two elder persons,
yes,
who originated from the Koreans which were evacuated by Stalin from the Far East, and they had quite a different pronunciation because they're from northern provinces, and also they were cut off from the language for 50 years. At first it was a challenge, but it worked out.
Now, as a Soviet in North Korea at that time, did you have diplomatic status, or were you different?
Yes.
Okay. Was it easy for you to move around? Did you have freedom of movement and freedom to talk to people who you wanted to talk to and visit the institutions you wanted to go to?
No, of course not. We have to apply for a visit to any institution, and it would take some time before we get the permission. If we would travel outside Pyongyang, except for Nampo, you have to send a note to the foreign ministry. They will grant you permission in 2 or 3 days usually. Mm-hmm. But I had some chance to go around with some Russian business delegations because there was lots of trade at that time. Didn't have the chance to go, all by myself. But I visited a lot of places in North Korea, starting from this period.
There were, of course, also North Koreans working at the USSR Trade Representation as drivers and assistants. And
No, we had none.
Oh, I see.
We had none, no. At that time, that was, all the people who would enter the fence of the Russian embassy compound would be Russians.
Oh, okay. All right.
Apart from those who would come just, as visitors to get the visas or for negotiations. But usually North Koreans prefer to have their talks and meetings not on our premises, but in the ministry or somewhere.
Yes. Okay.
In the hotels mostly, because most of the talking was at the time done at 3 or 4 hotels, which was only accessible at the time.
So if you went to, say, for example, Nampo on a long trip, did you have to drive yourself, or did a Korean...
No. We had our drivers, we had our cars.
Mm-hmm. And they're all Russian?
And the cars were Russian. Only one guy in our embassy had a Toyota imported from Japan, a right wheel.
Wow. Okay. And so during that 2-year period, what did you learn about North Korea, and how did North Korea surprise you?
I saw a country which originated from the Stalinist Soviet Union and stayed there. And even increased its repressive character by introducing more rigidness, by introducing more formal and overwhelming control.
Yeah.
That was a good, antidote for communism, I would say. I would tell it that way.
So before you left North Korea, you were, shall we say, disillusioned with...
Yes, I sort of understood that Soviet Union would be going somewhere, because the only way the communist system can function, it's the way North Korea did.
Repression and control.
Repression, control, and closeness. And the Soviet Union was much more different at the time. It was much more liberal. It was an evolution towards more freedom and more diversity. So that was the first time it came to my mind something has to be done in the Soviet Union, reform it or do whatever, because this kind of communist system can only function the way it does in North Korea.
Now, you returned to Pyongyang 4 years later in 1984 with a new doctorate in economics, and you worked for 3 years as an economist and representative of the Institute of Economics at the USSR Trade Representation in Pyongyang. So what did you observe at that time? Had North Korea changed in the 4 years that you were away, or was it exactly the same?
Well, first I should explain what Institute of the World Economy and Socialist Economy was.
Sure.
It was, one of the institutes at the Russian Academy of Science, which was subordinated directly to the Communist Party Central Committee Department on International Cooperation.
Okay.
So we thought we were a sort of think tank for the party headquarters and for the headquarters in general. As such, we enjoyed good access to information, and also one of the channels was that we had two persons in the embassy, in the trade section and in the embassy, in each then socialist country.
Oh, okay.
So they had access to everything, and that was quite a unique institute at the time. No others had that kind of privilege. We enjoyed some sort of academic freedom, and it was very interesting, to try to find new ways to explore possibilities. And being in North Korea, although I worked at the embassy, at the trade section, trade representation, still I had some possibilities to express my thoughts, to write something outside of the embassy rules. So it was interesting. The thing that changed over the years that I haven't been there was the dramatic change in Soviet-North Korean relations.
Oh.
Because during my first term, the relations were, I wouldn't say icy, but not so close. Mm-hmm. North Korea would lean to China then.
Yeah.
And we saw people like, Chinese leaders and people like Pol Pot there.
Okay.
Relations with Soviet Union were, very formal.
Mm-hmm.
Then in 1984, North Koreans decided to change the course. Kim Il-sung went to Soviet Union and European communist countries by train. He amazed everybody when getting back. He put on a necktie and a suit.
Oh, yes.
He never did before.
Yeah.
And that was seen as a sort of liberalization. And actually, there were some experiments in economy. For example, the joint venture law.
Oh.
Yes, it was published. I remember that I was sort of criticized by my bosses.
Yeah.
Because this joint venture law was published in Pyongyang Sinmun, in a local newspaper, on the 4th page.
Oh, yes.
And we somehow missed it, when reading the paper in the morning. And then we got this information, and my boss called me and said, why do I have to learn about from others, not from you?
Right.
So I remember well that when it was adopted. At the time, there was much more exchanges with the USSR because USSR provided some package of economic aid and military aid, and there were lots of more exchanges. At that time, I had a chance to visit with our delegations remotest corners of North Korea, even going down the pits in Tanchon and
into the coal mines or the salt mine.
Zinc ore,
Okay.
zinc polymetallic ore, and went to different places like Haeju, Sarewon, Chul, Sinuiju, lots of places, and not only just going for sightseeing, but going into the industrial enterprises, meeting the real, North Koreans.
Yep.
Of course, we couldn't speak much to them. They were very much afraid.
Right.
But since I knew the language, at least I could exchange a couple of words, and so they would see that although I'm a foreigner, I'm still a human being.
Yes, yeah.
So that was a shock for many at the time.
By the way, our first podcast guest, Andrei Lankov, was studying in Pyongyang at Kim Il-sung University at that same time. Did you meet each other then in Pyongyang?
I think yes. At the time I was already a family man and hold some bureaucratic position while he was just a student. So
Sure.
I saw him, but it was later than we started cooperating really in earnest.
Right.
Yes, because there were several students there, and they wouldn't venture much to the embassy. They would stay in the Kim Il-sung University where we wouldn't go.
Oh, okay. Now, at that time in the mid-1980s, in your understanding as an economist, was North Korea at that time operating under the principles of socialist economics, or had it already deviated from it?
First of all, we should agree on what principles of socialist economic is.
Sure.
And North Korea operated under the command and administrative system, much along the lines of the Stalinist Soviet Union. It kept pure this theory, like Korea kept pure Confucianism more than Chinese did centuries before, and so it was logical that any kind of deviation from the system brings actually havoc and bring problems to the livelihood. However, the shortcoming of this system is it uses their available resources very ineffectively, and there's not enough progress or innovation of any kind. So that's the way North Korean economy operated, and it was a planned economy, but the plan was never fully fulfilled, and it depended much on the imports of raw materials and technology from USSR and China and other countries, and on the export of its goods to these closed markets, because they couldn't export much to the free market. So there was quite a rigid and artificial system, which was just based on these principles and couldn't progress much.
But what about these 3, 5, and 7-year plans that were always being announced and held up as targets in North Korea? Did you see them as being real or realistic plans, or were they just for show?
Well, no one really knows, because the figures which were published had nothing to do with the reality.
Oh, dear.
Yes, and no one knows how they were implemented.
Yeah.
Because, well, for one thing, the North Koreans kept and still keep all the statistics secret. For another thing, well, also known from the Soviet Union example, when some kind of enterprise, a plant is given a planned target,
yes,
it's supposed to meet it, but it never does.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's changed, it's being corrected, and then even it has changed, the director of the plant tends to just to overdo or to write something in his report which is not true.
So he's exaggerating the figures.
He's exaggerating the figures. Yeah. It goes from bottom to the top.
Yes.
The individual worker try to exaggerate what he has done.
Right.
The master exaggerates what the unit has done. It goes up to the plant. The plant exaggerates and sends it to the provincial committee.
I see.
So it goes all up. And
so every level of the system is exaggerating a little bit more. And so cumulatively, there's a great deal of exaggeration at the top.
Cumulatively, it's not always accurate. It can be accurate, with things like, with physical measurement, like coal or maybe like iron or maybe even in this case. But in other cases, it gives a distorted impression of the economy. So I think that even North Korean planners would know exactly what's going on and how it should be dealt with. And they had to take some decisions based on this information. And it led to more problems. So it was the same with the Soviet Union. That's what we try to deviate from this.
So would I be correct if I assumed that you as an economist pretty much ignored these plans and looked at other information?
Well, the information in North Korea is very hard to come by. Sure. You know that. It was at that time even more, because there was no free market. There was no access to, independent information. There were no refugees. Yeah. Almost none.
So what were your sources for information then?
Well, first of all, of course, you need to read, North Korean newspapers and open sources very attentively, because you can see the accents changing, and you see new concepts and new targets being introduced. And if you do so day by day, you can feel where the wind is blowing, actually.
Right.
However, to get some hard data, of course, we had our own statistics for our trade. And based on the trade figures, we would know what's going on in certain branches of economy. Yeah. If North Koreans lag behind their deliveries, for example, of iron or zinc or lead, for example, we would know there are some problems. Okay. Because they got the oil and the needed commodities instead, so they were interested in fulfilling their targets.
Yeah.
So if it was there, well, then you would try to analyze why it happened. Was it because there was some kind of flood on the mine, or there was a lack of electricity, or there was a lack of, transportation capacity, or were all the workers taken to the countryside to help with the harvest, or to find some natural disaster?
Yeah.
It's a lot of, investigative job.
Yeah, right.
Also, at the time, we had a lot of Russian technicians working on key objects.
So that they're working on projects, but they would give you some information.
Yes, of course, they would know what's going on exactly. For example, at the Kimchak, at the
steelworks,
Kimchak also, yes, what's going on there? Would say, well, although they report that the cold roll stock is operating, at least it's not working.
I see.
Because there are problems with with equipment.
Right.
So we would know things like that. Then we try to accumulate it, and then we try to aggregate some indices and get the picture that would then go into the report. However, one mistake, South Koreans were doing and everybody else was doing was, trying to calculate North Korean GNP or growth rate by the methods that you would use in a market economy.
Oh.
There was no such thing as GNP in North Korea, because to have this GNP figures, you have to have the market prices,
right,
or at least some kind of the prices.
Yeah.
And if you suppose that they're equal to the world prices, then you're wrong, because the structure of the economy and proportion is quite different. So all the figures which are published by the Bank of Korea, by some Western institutions, we just laughed at them because it was just. At least we tried, as we said, we tried to look at the ceiling and get it from there. But they get it just from clear sky because they didn't have an office in Pyongyang. They had no ceiling to look at.
So it sounds like a kind of a detective work to measure the boundaries of the North Korean economy and to realize levels of different factors within that economy. It sounds like quite a lot of detective work that you were doing.
Right, because we had more or less clear picture about the foreign economic relations, foreign trade, apart, of course, from, trade in arms and things like that, which were, kept secret and kept out of the view of foreigners. And we had some first-hand experience from which we gathered on the ground. So I think at the time, the information we and Chinese gathered was the most accurate information on North Korea economy which existed outside North Korea, or maybe even within North Korea, as I've explained.
Right. Now, was that around the same time, I'm thinking the mid-1980s, when North Korea stopped paying overseas loans? There were some loans from Scandinavian countries, and I think it was around the same time. Did that...
Right. They didn't pay the Japanese loans. They didn't pay the Scandinavian loans. Although, for many years, I used the Volvo cars imported into these loans as taxis in Pyongyang. That was the main means of transportation. In Pyongyang, you would call and get a taxi.
Oh, that would be a Volvo.
It would be a Volvo, yes. So you can go somewhere, have a drink, and not risk, getting in an accident on your way back if you were driving.
So the loans from Scandinavian countries were used to buy these Volvos, which you used as taxis.
Right,
okay.
right. I think some of them are still running. I've been to Pyongyang. I've seen one or two in Pyongyang a couple of years ago. So that's a good, advertisement for Volvo.
Yeah, they're taking care of those vehicles. Yeah. Briefly, how is the North Korean economy today different from the time when you lived there in the 1980s?
Well, it's absolutely different. The economy have undergone a sort of cardinal reform because after the aid from Soviet Union abruptly ended in 1990, the civil sector of the economy just went spiraling down.
Okay.
Almost all of the, these big objects have just stopped working because they had no raw materials, they had no spare parts for the equipment, they had no market to send their products to. So much of the civil sector just stopped working.
Yeah.
It's still much the same.
There's no recovery in that area.
No, in some objects, yes, but much of the objects just stay idle. The Russian oil refinery and many others, it's just, either very much outdated and just working on the limits of its capacity or just staying idle. At the same time, the new economy has spread up. The market economy, the grassroots market economy without any regulations. Yeah. That's why, well, maybe in 1990, North Korean economy was the freest one and the most liberal in the world because they had no regulation whatsoever. And this is much of the economy we see now. We see this military-industrial complex, which is closed and planned and, well, more or less works like a big armament corporation. And with the, inter-corporation communication and planning. And we have this civil centralized sector, which provides for, infrastructure like electricity, like big enterprises, big plants like the iron production or coal mines. Yeah. And we have a real free sector which produces daily commodities, which provides services, which engages in trade both inside the country and outside the country. And this sector is taking more and more in Korean economy and the life of Koreans. Mm-hmm. No one can calculate, and as I've said, you don't have any instrument for calculation because you don't know the prices and how this price system operates. Although now it operates more or less on market principles, but I think it's taken at least more than a half of North Korean economy.
Do you still regularly visit North Korea?
Yes, of course. I try to get there at least once a year. Last time I was there in September, and I'm going again in March probably.
And how are you received in North Korea?
It's now quite easier to get around and easier, to communicate. Mm-hmm. Because the younger generation, they're more curious about people from abroad. In the past, if you would ask a North Korean how to get to this place when walking on the street, he would probably run away. Okay. These days, sometimes he would answer, and he would even try to hold some kind of conversation.
You're able to walk around Pyongyang without having a guide with you?
I'm not a guided person. I'm not a tourist.
So you have a more or less freedom to move as you wish.
Yes, well, of course, the North Korean, guards, they sometimes are very much surprised at where's your guide.
Yes.
And when I say I don't have any guide. I don't need one. It's easier for me because, well, we spent so many years there.
So that's because of your previous status as a diplomat that they...
Well, because of experience. Of course, I cannot go to some off-the-limits places.
Sure, yeah.
But I know my way around, at least in Pyongyang.
Okay, and you can go to shops and talk with people, buy things, use local currency. Right. All the things that tourists cannot do.
Local currency, you don't much use it because you usually get it as an exchange or change it and then spend it. Yeah. Well, there's real money now in North Korea. Even the national currency is a currency. It's not just the paper which it used to be.
Right. Yeah. What about the two exchange rates?
Oh, the first one, the official, is just for statistics. Okay. Just to stipulate the prices in the shops which trade for foreign currency. Yeah. So it wouldn't be stipulated in dollars or euros or yuan for that matter, but just in some kind of a unit. Yes. It's absolutely. It has nothing to do with the real prices. You just divide it by 10 and you get a price in dollars, and then you calculate from how much would be in yuan or in euro, whatever.
Okay, and then the free floating exchange rate?
Yes, well, it's there. It's a real exchange rate. You can exchange by this rate at the local currency exchange offices.
Mm-hmm. Some people still call it a black market rate, but you would say it's not really a black market rate. It's simply
it's a free market rate.
Market rate, okay.
And it's very stable, by the way. So I think that North Korean won is sort of pegged with the dollar, one of the few currencies these days.
What's the current free floating exchange rate?
Something right about 8,000, I think.
8,000 to $1.
Yes, I haven't been there for a while, but in September, around 8,000, yeah.
All right, I'd like to talk now a little bit about diplomatic relations. Mm-hmm. Diplomatic relations between South Korea and the Soviet Union were forged on September 30th, 1990. And in 1991, you became director of the Korean division at the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So can you tell us about the process of rapprochement between the Soviet Union and South Korea at that time and your role in it?
Well, I wouldn't exaggerate my personal role, but I was in this process from the start. There was lots of interest in South Korea way back from 1970s.
Really?
Yes, I remember. My graduation work. Yep. At the university was in fact on South Korean economy.
Really?
Yeah.
Your graduate thesis?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Even at that time, there are lots of suggestions from scholars to the government to establish some kind of an official cooperation with South Korea.
Right.
Even in the end of 1970s, there were some movement towards some trade.
Yeah.
There was, in fact, some trade, because for the third countries, I remember going to a local shop in Moscow and seeing the sweater stated Korea, made in Korea. Looked, and it was certainly not made in North Korea.
Right.
And that was just...
And that was when?
It was 1980 something.
Okay.
And so we were actually moving towards, more closer cooperation at the time. But then this unfortunate incident with the Korean airline happened.
Yeah.
So it all stopped. It was all frozen, and it was like...
What year was that?
83.
83. Okay. That was while you were in the Soviet Union, between your two stints.
Right.
Okay.
No, I think I was a couple of months before I left for a North Korean mission.
Right.
And then it stopped, and it was only somewhere around 1986 where this movement of rapprochement began again.
Mm-hmm.
There was a decision to permit direct trading between Soviet foreign trade organizations, South Korean companies.
Right.
And then it was Gorbachev time. In 1988, the Gorbachevs, Krasnoyarsk and Vladivostok's speeches, which for the first time said that it's possible to establish relations with South Korea. We took part in the previous Olympics, and the Russian-Soviet team was very popular.
Right.
By the time of the Olympics, we already had some consular group here with Russian diplomats coming here and just making some kind of exchanges.
Right.
And then from 1988, I moved to the then Soviet Chamber of Commerce and Industry, which was not a public organization, actually. That was a branch of the Foreign Economic Relations Ministry.
Okay.
And I became, the officer in charge of South Korea. I headed the so-called business council between Soviet-South Korean Business Council.
Yeah.
And it was, sort of division of the ministry overseeing the economic relations with South Korea. And there was a flood of delegation and exchanges.
Yeah.
In our office, almost every day come in a delegation of South Korean businessmen, maybe 20, 30 people, which looked around in bewilderment. And the attraction also was we had a big Lenin picture in the conference hall.
Oh gosh!
They would see it and they said, "Okay, let's take a picture." And they would stay under this portrait and take maybe still here in the files there. Hundreds of these pictures of myself staying under this portrait with different South Korean business missions. And also, I still continued as a scholar. Academic exchanges played a lot of role in establishment diplomatic relations.
Well, now, how did North Korea react to this rapprochement?
Well, they were very critical. I wasn't much connected with North Korea then. I mostly spent most of it on South Korea, but I knew from my colleagues in the foreign ministry that they were very critical, very suspicious, and actually they were quite ready for what was going on. Maybe they didn't think that it would go this fast, but they were ready. The crucial points was the invitation of Kim Jong-sam to Moscow. That was an affair I took some part in, and I met him then for the first time. When we also, one of our delegations went to Seoul and met Kim Jong-sam and others, and I accompanied it. It was headed by the then, Politburo member.
But Kim Jong-sam became president here in South Korea in 1993. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So already the relations, and there was already a consul here.
Yes, he was very much instrumental in bridging the gap between, Soviet leadership and the South Korean leadership, because he became the ruling party associate at that time. Yeah. And actually, some people here said that without this Soviet activity, he might have become a president.
Oh, really?
Yes. There are some people, I don't know whether it's right, but some people who say that here. And then this rapprochement brought about the meeting of Gorbachev with North Korea in June 1990, and Shevardnadze, then foreign minister, went to Pyongyang. And he wasn't accepted by Kim Il-sung.
Oh dear.
And he said he heard some very harsh words from Kim Jong-nam, then foreign minister, who said
who was here recently.
Yes, right. He's still there,
Yeah.
I know him for 40 years, I think. He's still the same. And then Kim Jong-sam told him there about, I think, 6 points. We'll recognize Soviet republics, we'll recognize Japanese claims for territorial, we will do something with China.
Yeah.
And in the condition of existence of nuclear weapons in South Korea, we'll have to take the measures to counterbalance them with the new types of weapons. So that was the first time they officially told us, not in a direct form though, that they are working on nuclear weapons.
Right.
Shevardnadze became so furious when he came to New York for the General Assembly sessions, where the agreement on relations was supposed to be signed. When he was supposed to meet South Korean minister, he was brought an article from Nodon Sinmun criticizing this Russia-Soviet South Korean rapprochement.
Yes.
And there was no Korean translator there, so they just tried to get something out of this article, and he understood that he was criticized personally.
Oh, I see.
Which was not there, but which he was enraged with.
Uh-oh.
And when meeting the South Korean president, he said, we will establish a relation from today.
Oh.
Not from the 1st of January 1991, as was prepared.
I see. So there was a sudden change of plan because of that Rodong Shinmun article.
Right.
Goodness me. So this is interesting that the Korean division at the Russian Foreign Ministry, which you were at that time director of, changed from dealing with one Korea, which was North Korea. Now it's dealing with two Koreas, North and South. That seems like a very delicate balancing act.
Well, at first, when there was some kind of restructuring in the foreign ministry, everybody wanted to have something to do with South Korea, and there was an idea that it should be moved into the department which deals with Japan.
Yeah.
And so we say, no. Well, let's do it like that. And we always dealt in the Korean section, has always dealt with South Korea, although indirectly. Okay. So we gathered information, we get some analysis on that. So it was always dealing with South Korea, although indirectly.
Right.
In 1988, we have established an office of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry.
Yep.
Where I worked at the time, here in Seoul as a first representation. It was in COEX Center. And I was actually supposed to go there to work at this office. But then this whole revolution happened, so it's changed overnight. But we had our diplomats working here in this office as a consular section.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And South Koreans had the same. We sent here our consular officer, who became then Minister Counsel of the embassy, middle-level bureaucrat, while South Koreans sent Mr. Kon No-myun, who became then foreign minister, who was very high-ranking in South Korean diplomatic hierarchy.
Now, later on, so from 1993 to 98, you actually served here as Minister Counsellor. And during that time, while you were here in South Korea, a lot of things happened. Kim Il-sung died in North Korea. Kim Jong-il took over as chairman of the National Defense Commission. Hwang Jang-yeop defected to South Korea, and 2 North Korean submarines were caught in South Korean water, with all the submariners dying or killing themselves. So what do you remember most from your time here, and how was the atmosphere for you?
Of course, we enjoyed that atmosphere because, we were finally made it to South Korea, and it was a country unknown to most of the Russians, and there was lots of delegation coming and establishing relations, and we as the embassy had to get lots of new contacts, and we were very much, in demand here at the time. There are also very much dramatic events.
Yeah.
That was the first time nuclear crisis of 93-94 broke out.
Oh, I'd forgotten to mention that, yes.
Yes, and I remember when these people around here would run to the shops, buy some ramen and, stocks for the possible conflict. Yeah. We never believed there will be conflict. We were amazed at that and a little bit, bewildered that the people here take this North Korean danger so seriously.
Yeah.
There was the events that you've mentioned. I remember when Hwang Sun-yeop defected. I was with my ambassador. I was in Incheon.
Okay.
In Incheon, there was the first ever visit by Russian military ship Varag on the celebration of 19th anniversary of the Varag sinking in Russo-Japanese War at the same place. And we were on the ship, and I had a mobile phone, which was rarity by that time. And suddenly I got a phone call from the foreign ministry here, and they asked me, well, we're looking for ambassador. He's here with me. Right. The minister wants to talk to him. Well, okay. And I gave the phone to him, and he listened and said, well, they said somebody called Hwang Sun-yeop has defected. Who the hell he is? And I tried to explain, well, as far as I knew. And
because you knew him?
No, I never met him, but I knew in general who he was at the time, and we had to get back urgently to Seoul to meet the minister and get this information. And nobody was in Russia was quite understandable what happened so much that it would demand that kind of reaction.
When Kim Il-sung died in 1994, did you at any stage expect that things would change in North Korea, or that North Korea might collapse? You thought it would continue?
No. Well, it was absolutely clear that the preparation for this hereditary succession of power were well underway, because we've been watching Kim Jong-il's rise from middle 70s, and I was there, and when there were new buildings appeared near embassy, and the North Koreans said this is the center of the party who ordered building this.
Right.
And there were, some new shops and new restaurants, and that was the center of the party who ordered this.
Yeah, because the party center was like a nickname, not a nickname, but like a secret title, I suppose, for Kim Jong-il until he was...
Yes, until he was, formally introduced.
In 1980, wasn't it?
Well, no. Well... Later. In fact, when Kim Il-sung went to Soviet Union in 1984, it was Kim Jong-il who carried on all the talks with Russian diplomats about the arrangement of this visit.
Right.
So he was sort of in charge of command of logistics and things like that. So we knew him quite well.
Okay, so you completely expected him to take over and continue to lead North Korea, right?
And we didn't have any kind of doubts that he will manage, that the system will keep on existing, although it will pass a hard time. Now, for 30 years, I've been telling my counterparts in US, Japan, South Korea, that don't expect North Korean collapse.
Right.
But we were never heard.
Yeah. Now, near the end of your time at the embassy in Seoul, South Korean President Kim Dae-jung announced his sunshine policy. Mm-hmm. Were you hopeful at the time for improved inter-Korean relations? Did you expect to see much result from that?
Well, I met Kim Dae-jung, and even before he became a president, I still hold a calligraphy from him personally. I thought that he was a very, noble person with a great vision, but I doubted that that would get anywhere. Because he was not a bureaucrat, and he had no support from the entrenched conservative ruling class, which was created here over the decades, and he had no support from the US. Also, North Koreans were very much suspicious at first of the sunshine policy, because they perfectly seized the idea that the sunshine policy had a sort of hidden agenda to undermine North Korean regime by opening up. And they were very much suspicious, and they reprimanded us for supporting this policy. Well, never mention this word. Never say anything in support of us, because it's aimed at undermining our republic. Mm-hmm. But then the tide changed. North Koreans saw that they could get some profit out of it and get something for their development.
Free things, free money, free...
Not only that, not only free things of support, but also some reduction in tension and more the cracks in U.S.-South Korean alliance. So they decided to use it. What they didn't take into account that they would change themselves as well, and it did. But they might haven't thought about it seriously, but I saw how they were changing.
Can you tell us a bit more about that? How did the sunshine policy change North Korea?
Well, the North Korean cadres, they saw, different different country. They saw different option. They became less suspicious to South Koreans. Well, because of this national identity thing, they started to think differently. And also the population got some wind of, well, how things are in South Korea. South Koreans, well, commodities and things. So it changed the psychology of the country. And I think it's by that time that population and maybe the nomenclature or the ruling class understood, okay, we lost this competition with South Korea. We cannot win in the war with them, but we can do something else. We can coexist and we can keep our identity. I thought this was a crucial time of national reconciliation, year 2000. This time.
That's interesting. Now, I'm going to fast forward to the current day because we're running short of time now. In an interview with NK News last year, you said that the North Korean, quote, completion of a state nuclear force offers a window of opportunity for dialogue. You said, I believe that this is the perfect chance to start a peace-building process, and if it would start from the Olympics, then that would still be highly symbolic. Now, your statement last December was almost prophetic, since this is more or less what has happened. For listeners, we will link to your December 13th interview on the podcast homepage so they can go back and read it in full. But for us now, would you like to talk about where things are at the moment and how you see things progressing in terms of inter-Korean dialogue and North Korea-US dialogue?
Well, unfortunately, it's the North Korea who are the actor, who are the player, who take the initiatives.
They're in the driving seat, are they?
They're in the driver's seat. They've always been, unfortunately. South Korea, at least now, has some role in this, in this play.
Yeah.
Because during the late Park Geun-hye era, South Korea didn't have any role. It was just followed the US, and North Korea didn't take South Korea seriously. It has now changed, and North Koreans are using South Korea very effectively, both to state their cause and to change the strategic situation. And that when they want to move really fast, and you see that they have unexpectedly just yesterday decided to send the high-level delegation here, which I think has started off Pyongyang today. We shall see what they have in mind, because I suppose that they could make some new proposals, new ideas, which would have to get the reaction from South Korea, from the President Moon's government, and it can change the strategic equation. And the crucial issue, of course, is now whether the renewal of US-North Korea confrontation will be supported by South Korea or not.
Right.
And whether this US-North Korea confrontation would spiral even further, or the situation will be stabilized. And of course, for that, the US-North Korea direct dialogue is essential. And the stumbling block, of course, is the world of denuclearization.
Yes, America wants complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement, CVID, of the North Korean nuclear program. And you've said before, most recently in your December interview, that this will never happen because the nuclear program is sacred to North Korea.
Right.
So what can the US and North Korea talk about?
Well, my suggestion is, and I made it public today, that they should talk about nuclear program, not denuclearization. But let's meet North Koreans and let them explain. Well, they boast they have nuclear weapons.
Yes.
If you have nuclear weapons, a state with having nuclear weapons is supposed to have some nuclear doctrine. Mm-hmm. USA has it, Russia has it. Anybody has a published nuclear doctrine. Part of it's a secret when, how, and when, and
under what circumstances we will use these nuclear weapons.
Yes.
That sort of doctrine.
Yes. Well, I don't know whether North Koreans have it or not, and nobody knows outside this country what's in it.
Yes.
So why not let them just meet US and others and explain what they have in mind? That means that we'll speak about nuclear problem. It could then start with some kind of limitation and with the distant aim of denuclearization many years from now. But the process should be started somewhere.
So it's a kind of a de facto recognition of North Korea as a nuclear power?
Well, it is not, because to be a nuclear power, North Koreans have to be inside the NPT treaty, and they're not going there. And I ask them about that. They say, we don't care about whether anybody recognizes us or not. We're not asking to become the permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, they say, as a nuclear power. We just having it, and we don't care what others say. They really this issue of recognition is, I think, is just U.S. understanding of the things. If you talk to a country or to some entity which has nuclear power, it doesn't mean that you recognize it, because it's there. You can recognize it, but it's there.
Now, what about a peace treaty between the US and North Korea? North Korea has said for decades that it wants one. Do you believe it actually wants a peace treaty with the US? And is this a realistic aim?
What they want is some kind of recognition. They thought they came close to it in 1994 with the agreed framework. Then they found out they were sort of cheated by Clinton, because what Clinton expected was the collapse of North Korea. And regardless of letters signed by him, regardless of communique they had with Chairman Rock. So they're cautious, but they want some kind of formal recognition, which is actually normal, because this is the UN member which exists for 70 years. Yeah. And U.S. doesn't recognize that such a country exists at all. This is actually ridiculous. You can have much more leverage about a country if you have some at least formal relations, and you can freely talk and not try to avoid each other like Vice President Pence did last time.
But recognition of the existence of the North Korean state by the United States, wouldn't that also be connected to the issue of mutual recognition of the North Korean and South Korean states of each other's right to exist? I mean, North Korea...
That's purely North and South Korea's business. They can consider themselves parts of the same country. They can consider themselves some kind of special relationship they have, but it doesn't have much to do with the U.S., North Korea, Japan, North Korea relations. Of course, North-South relations different, and some status can be found here, but it has nothing to do with the formal diplomatic relations of North Korea with other states. After all, South Korea was recognized by Soviet Union and China a long time ago, and that doesn't who recognized North Korea before that, and that doesn't change anything in the relations in these triangles.
Okay, I'm going to ask my final question now. You've been thinking about North Korea and, both Koreas for 4 decades now. 15 years ago, you co-wrote a slim booklet titled The Ways of Overcoming the Crisis on the Korean Peninsula. And you've also written other similar works looking at short, medium and long-term options for solving the crisis on the Korean Peninsula. In what ways have your proposals made 15 years ago changed? What would you recommend today?
Well, thank you for reading attentively my work, but I don't remember what was written there 15 years ago. But I would tell you, Frank, that I keep the same position for last 30 years. North Korea will exist. It's our choice whether it will exist as a cornered and hostile nuclear-armed now country, which is sort of outlaw, and now we push them by sanctions into criminal business activity because they won't stop their business, but they will have this, make it criminalized. Or it can be a very specific, not approved of, but a country which is recognized and which can develop and which can gradually evolve, what they call conventionalize, become a normal country. And that's our choice. And I think that the way we should do, there should be a national reconciliation between North and South, not leading to unification in the first stage. North Korea and South Korea should just coexist for some time together, and the people here will decide whether to unify or not.
Right, but North Korea does talk about unification as an aim a lot. It's in the slogans, posters, songs, speeches, etc. Do you think it's really an important goal for North Korea in the short to medium term, or can it postpone it sort of endlessly?
Well, this is kind of a religion, this is kind of ideology they aimed at, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're serious. Actually, to fight find out, you have to talk to them, you have to communicate, you have to just to find out how serious they are. And the only way is to let these two countries coexist, not necessarily unifying it with each other in near term. After all, people of same ethnic origin coexist in different states. Why don't you, unify Australia and New Zealand, for example, or something like that? So they can coexist, and then they can unify, form a unified state, but before this hostility should go. And to do this, to enable this, of course, U.S. should recognize North Korea and Japan as well, and it should be given some space for development. It should be given some security guarantees, which would make their not only nuclear weapons, but further militarization redundant. Because this militarization goes in different areas, and we don't know what will happen next in the cyber war capabilities and others. The world is changing, and if North Koreans remains to be hostile and cornered, it would invent new ways, even other than nuclear weapons, to be dangerous to the world, and nobody needs that.
So recognition, engagement, security guarantees, and allowing North Korea to conventionalize as a state and develop. These are the ways forward as far as you can see.
Right.
Well, thank you very much for your time today, Professor Toloraya. We thank you for your wonderful interview with us. And listeners, we encourage you to check back next week for our next NK News podcast. And always look at nknews.org for all your North Korean news. Thank you very much.